Good morning. Today is March 3rd, 2025. And for our agenda today, I wanted to talk about seller default. Now, there are many ways a buyer can default in a contract. We even have a provision in the contract that predetermines what the remedies are if that happens. The earnest money, right? What about the seller? Do sellers even default? Of course they do. We don't, however, have a remedy in the contract for that scenario. So, what happens when sellers default in a contract and that contract cannot close? Today, we will be discussing the situations where a seller may find themselves in default under the contract obligations. Now, anytime we discuss the idea of contracts defaulting, we are typically shifting our conversation words and shifting them towards talking to an attorney because we know that there are bigger consequences than just not signing on the dotted line. So I'm not going to be discussing necessarily what happens in the event of the default, but rather just ways a seller may find themselves in a situation where they could be defaulting in their transaction. So let's start at the beginning. I wanted to pull up the purchase and sale agreement because on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement, it has places where there could be a potential default right off the bat. Now, the purchase and sale agreement is the main form that we use for our real estate transactions, and it spells out the obligations that buyers and sellers each have. The first thing we need to make sure of is that we are selling to the legal owner of the property. So making sure that the seller's name matches the seller on the title is quite important. And then making sure that then when they sign along the dotted line on the bottom, that they are doing so in that exact name as well. Now, another thing that could come up is included items. Now, there's a list of included items on line number 5 right here that are going to be considered to convey with the property at closing. Now, if any of these included items that are supposed to be left are not left, if the seller fails to leave anything on here, they may be finding themselves in default because according to this paragraph, they have agreed to leave the included items as listed here. When signing the first page of the purchase and sale agreement, we want to make sure that the full legal name is used in this place. So this means the full legal name as it is on title with no abbreviations. We want to ensure that the seller and the buyer have signed their full names to help move that transaction towards a closing very smoothly. This is one of the moving parts when it comes to all the pieces of how the transaction moves forward. But in the signature at the bottom line, it is the seller's first agreement to perform the obligations that they've promised to within the contract. Now, in our purchase and sale, in the boilerplate language, it says here that the seller must provide marketable title. That's item number C. This means that the ownership must be able to transfer to the new buyer from the current ownership of the seller. So see your title company if you discover anything in here that makes that not possible or that might cause the title to not be able to be conveyed. Now, when the title transfers, the purchase and sale agreement says it's going to transfer via a statutory warranty deed. Now, if that title is not transferred just as that, as the statutory warranty deed, and the seller chooses to transfer it in a different type of way, like a bargain and sale deed or a real estate contract, or list any other ways that a title could be conveyed, then the seller is actually not adhering to the promises that the seller made by this form alone. If you are going to change the way that the title is transferred, be mindful of this and make sure that you note that somewhere else in the contract that it's agreed upon, because if not, it automatically will default to the statutory warranty deed. And come closing, if the statutory warranty deed is not the way the title is transferred, the buyer could claim that the seller did in fact breach that contract. Now, when you're dealing with real estate sales, we are most likely going to always encounter the statutory warranty deed. However, when it comes to estates, they may be transferred in a different way. So make sure the first thing you do when you get a listing is to pull the title and check on there to see how that ownership is transferred. Now, the seller must also provide an insurable title. So if the seller is not able to do, the buyer is in fact entitled to their earnest money as a remedy of that uninsurable title. Now, without any additional contingencies, the buyer does have the right to that marketable title. If the seller is unable to provide this, the buyer will be free to recover their earnest money. Now, in a situation where a seller's action or inaction is something that triggers a consequence with a buyer, that's not necessarily a breach in the contract. However, it just could be one of those hurdles. So I'm not pulling this one up as an example of a breach necessarily. This is more or less something that could happen very close to closing that might trip up your process. Now, on the closing date, we're still on the purchase and sale agreement right here. This is paragraph F, talking about closing and possession. On the closing date, the seller is required to vacate the home and hand over keys at 9 p.m. or, if noted otherwise, whatever that time says. A seller may be in breach if there's a holdover on the move out. So if the seller retains possession past that contracted time, the seller would in fact be in breach. There's nothing in the contract that says that they're allowed to be there beyond that time. The buyer would have to be careful as to what the next steps they take to remedy this. There is a chance that maybe the seller's just running behind and the seller may be moving out, or we don't know the complications of how far this could progress, and we could be looking at somebody who doesn't want to move out anymore and has changed their mind, in which case we as real estate agents are out of the picture and we need to refer it to somebody else like a real estate attorney. If there are items that the seller has failed to deliver at closing, remember the seller has to deliver keys, garage door openers, access to all of the mailboxes. So all of that is listed in this paragraph when it comes to transferring ownership. If the seller has not complied by delivering such items, they also may find themselves in breach. Unfortunately, as brokers, we're helpless when it comes to this scenario. Once that transaction closes, our duties and responsibilities are no longer we're no longer in a capacity where we can advise or even help. We really just have to move them forward to a real estate attorney if there's going to be a dispute after closing. Sellers must also, within this paragraph, comply with the state, local, and federal laws within real estate. So line 89 talks about the home being equipped with carbon monoxide alarms and smoke alarms. All homes must be equipped with carbon monoxide alarms and smoke alarms. So do keep that in mind. Minimum requirement is one in the house, and compliance according to the fire department and safety regulations is going to be quite a bit more than just one in the whole house. Still in the purchase and sale agreement, paragraph V. If the seller fails to disclose lead-based paint, then the seller has not performed their responsibilities. We know that prior to 1978, any home that's sold requires the 22J as well as the lead-based paint pamphlet. Now, when you have something like this obligation to disclose, or an example would be the Form 17, the seller does have that obligation to deliver these things to the buyer. However, there is a consequence for that seller if those things are not delivered. Number one, with this lead-based paint, this is a federal form, so there could potentially be federal consequences. With Form 17, there could be other consequences down the road. But in either case, if not delivered, the buyer does have rights within that contract. So these wouldn't necessarily be considered a breach. However, they would trigger a series of events for the seller that would be unfortunate. Now, still in the purchase and sale agreement, the seller does have the obligation to keep the property in its current condition. So this condition is basically assumed that all the systems and appliances are functioning unless described elsewhere. That would be in, say, a Form 17, that the property would remain insured, that the property condition itself would be remaining intact. This would be a situation where if there was damage from the weather, the seller would fix. The seller is promising to keep the property in the condition that the buyer has purchased it. There are times where we have unexpected events. One time, a tree fell through a door, and the seller was unaware that as of this paragraph, you're required to have that door replaced. And if refusing to do, at the very least, would need to redisclose it on the Form 17, thus re-triggering that buyer's 3-day right of rescission. So just other ways that sellers can potentially put themselves in a position of breach. Now, another thing that we look at is the inspection contingency. Anytime the seller is given a duty or has agreed to an obligation and chooses not to do it, that is an area where the seller would be in breach. And one of those is the repairs that may be requested on an inspection contingency. This form right here references our inspection contingency, paragraph 7, when it says that the seller is going to be doing repairs. Now, on an inspection contingency, the seller is going to agree to do this work. A common argument in real estate is the performance of the repair requests. So this will come down to you needing to be writing clear and concise language. But even after that, the sellers have been known not to fulfill their end of the deal on this one. If you find yourself with a seller who is not complying with the repairs that you have requested, is interpreting them in a different way, or just not doing them at all, those are potential places where we could see a breach in the seller. There are so many ways that this could unfold that I won't necessarily go into examples or details of this. But if you find yourself in a situation where a seller is not meeting the repairs that were requested, refusing to do work on it, or arguing that the work was done not to buyer's satisfaction, this is when you need to start getting other people involved, get your designated broker involved, and if necessary, get a real estate attorney involved. Okay, the last place that a seller, and this may not be the last, this is just the last one that came to my mind when I was putting this together. The last place the seller can breach is by the refusal to sign closing documents completely. There have been various reasons for a seller to threaten this, but if you happen to find yourself in this position, please speak to your seller, advise your seller to speak to an attorney, speak to your designated broker, just to talk about the consequences of this action. So in order to avoid a seller default, the seller must make every action possible to fulfill their obligations at closing. This means they must schedule their signing, sign the closing documents, take no action to intentionally delay or to avoid closing. Is failing to provide the Form 17 a seller breach? No, it is not technically a seller breach. The seller is required to deliver a Form 17 per state law. However, if the seller fails to deliver the form, the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. When a buyer has a right to take action after a seller's inaction, there is no breach to the contract, but rather a choice in direction. So please make sure we are using these words very carefully if we're discussing the term breach with anybody in this transaction. Sellers can breach a contract just as a buyer can breach. When drafting your purchase and sale agreement, keep these possible scenarios in mind and make sure that you're advising your client carefully. A seller breach is not simply failing to deliver a document that's required, but rather a contract break. The break where a buyer would have nothing played out in the next step or any other course of action to take that's already determined in our purchase and sale agreement. Typically, these breaches are followed by a lawsuit or at best two agents who can work together to modify the contract and allow time to resolve. So be mindful of a seller's potential breaches in your contract and be prepared to refer to an expert, as it will definitely exceed the scope of your duties as a broker. With this perspective in mind, we can better navigate our clients through a smooth closing. Thank you.